Thank you, Brett. This is Brad Barth. Just a little bit of background real quick. My role here at HardDollar is really in everything that has to do with the product itself, product strategy, product management, managing release schedules and things like that. And I've been with the company a little over 20 years, so I go way back here at HardDollar. And as Brett mentioned, we're going to really focus today on one aspect of the HardDollar application, and that is how the system integrates with Primavera. We've spent a lot of time, a lot of energy on making sure that we can integrate with P6 in a very dynamic way, in a real-time, seamless manner. And that's been based on a lot of feedback from mutual customers of both Primavera and HardDollar. And so we'll give you a few slides. I imagine some of you out there are not familiar with HardDollar, so I'll give you a little bit of slides to start with. I promise I won't spend more than a few minutes on that, just to kind of set the stage. And then we'll jump in and do an actual scenario and show you some typical use cases for, why would you want to use Primavera and HardDollar together. So just as a bit of a background, on HardDollar itself, our focus is really on some key markets in terms of oil and gas, infrastructure, energy, utilities, STO, those types of projects. We've been around since the 1980s, and we have thousands of users around the world, primarily on the contractor side, but also on the owner side and the EPCM side as far as construction managers and engineering companies. Let me hand it back over to Brett for just a second to talk a little bit about CDP.
Thank you, Brad. So CDP has been a partner with HardDollar for about 2.5, 3 years now, and our focus has been since 1983 on providing the engineering construction industry with solutions to help them to meet their project needs. So we provide software solutions like HardDollar. We also provide training, support, and integration services. We're based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we have offices in Richmond, Virginia, Columbia, Maryland, and Philadelphia. And we do work not only throughout the U.S., but worldwide. Thank you very much. Brad, back to you.
Great. And we're excited to work with CDP and love what they're doing out there in the industry, and being able to provide that sort of local, hands-on presence for HardDollar. They've been fantastic. As you can see here, some of the customers that are using the HardDollar solution, you can see some of the logos there, some of our probably more recognizable companies. One thing I'd like to point out, though, we do have some of the largest companies in the world are HardDollar customers, but we also have a lot of customers. In fact, the majority of our customers are small to medium-sized companies doing all kinds of different projects and different sized projects. So really, we run the gamut of industries and company sizes. So what is HardDollar? If you look at this graphic, this kind of sums it up. The major things that folks tend to get involved in when you're taking a project through the life cycle, you kind of start with, there's some sort of design, takeoff, engineering that goes on to really determine and define the scope of the project. Then you get into some sort of estimating, budgeting, cost modeling stage. At some point, you're developing a schedule for the project. As the project gets going, you're tracking progress and variances and forecasting and those sorts of things. And then ultimately, along the way, your financial system is sort of looking backwards and tracking, what's happened, what have we spent, and so forth. So the ones in yellow there are the things that HardDollar really focuses on. There are obviously systems out there that do a fantastic job in those other blue boxes. And obviously today we're going to focus on that one right in the middle. So Primavera falls right into that schedule slot, and then as you can see, HardDollar kind of operates on either side of that in the estimating stage and in the progress management and execution stage. As far as estimating goes, we have a very robust estimating tool set that we've developed over 20+ years. we have just about any way you can think of to put an estimate together, whether you want to use third-party data such as RS means, you want to bring in quantities and scope from a design or takeoff system. Do you want to use your own historic information, perhaps for benchmarking or your own templates? And of course, quotes from subs, vendors, suppliers, all of that can be incorporated into your cost models and your estimates. Now, one of the things we hear all the time is, you really can't. In fact, one of my favorite questions is, what do you do first? Do you do an estimate first, or do you do a schedule first? And the best answer that I usually hear is, well, they're really the same thing. It's just a different view of the same thing. You can't do one without doing the other. So, Primavera does a great job of really applying the timing of a project and understanding relationships between the activities in the project and when they can start, et cetera. And it has a little bit of cost capabilities and cost management capabilities, but if you want to do a full estimate, with contingencies and escalations and other things that are really not part of the schedule, that's where something like HardDollar comes in. But it's critical that they work together. We can't, we don't believe you can finalize an estimate on the HardDollar side without really understanding what the schedule looks like. Because that schedule is going to dictate things like, simple things like how long is the overall project going to take, which might dictate, are we renting a project trailer and we're paying for that by the month? We need to know how many months. If we have a project manager for the whole project, we need to know how long that cost is going to go on. So a lot of things, those are simple examples, but obviously a lot of costs in an estimate are going to be a function of the schedule. So we've created a very, as I mentioned, very dynamic integration between the two tools. And you can kind of see here how things line up. We don't always use the same terms, but things line up pretty nicely. We both work with accounts. We both work with resources, activities, what Primavera calls a WBS, if you're familiar with that term. In HardDollar, we call it a CBS, or cost breakdown structure. So cost breakdown structure really includes, it should include costs for everything in the WBS, but then there, as I mentioned, there's probably some other things that you guys have in your budgets and your estimates that you won't necessarily find in a schedule. Overheads, profit, contingencies, things like that. This sort of shows a different view of kind of some sources of information. As the project gets into that execution stage, how do we get data in from the field? One of the things that HardDollar does really well is tracking progress and helping you do forecasts at completion and dealing with changes, change management. And so then the question is, well, where do we get the data that tells us where we're at? Well, you can enter that directly into HardDollar in terms of tracking your quantities, your man hours, your equipment hours, and we can calculate earned value from that as well. So those entries can be done directly in HardDollar. We can bring them in from a spreadsheet. We can bring them in from a timesheet system to give you those quantities and hours, as well as from your financial system. We work with about 28, I believe it is, different financial systems. And then lastly here, we do have a very nice self-service web-based reporting capability. So whether you're using HardDollar for estimating and cost modeling, whether you're using it for the project delivery stage and tracking progress and forecasts, you can feed all that information into our web-based reporting tool to look across projects, maybe to do reports by division, look across disciplines, track KPIs. And again, it's a self-service mode, so your employees, even your partners, if you authorize, can hit a website and look at, how is the project doing, how are we doing overall as a company, and things like that. So let's talk about who typically uses the HardDollar tool. You can kind of see the roles that are most often involved in using both HardDollar and Primavera. Obviously, when you talk about scheduling, you're talking about a very common role for Primavera. Over on the left side, when you talk about estimating and project controls, anything that has to do with managing cost of a project, cost and productivity, those roles are very heavy HardDollar users. And then you have other roles that are kind of, they might be read-only roles into both of those systems, financial people, procurement people, owners, engineers, construction managers, et cetera. But HardDollar, at the end of the day, anybody that's looking at cost models, looking at cash flow, looking at earned value, forecasting, those are typically the types of people that are using HardDollar in and out of the tool every day. So the benefit that the system provides, getting those cost models created more quickly is a huge benefit. We find customers are reducing the time that is spent managing a project by 15% or more, driving those costs down, and cutting the time it takes to get to the reports, whether it's a proposal or a estimate detail report or budget detail report, or whether we're talking about project status reports, forecast reports. Cutting that time down dramatically, which obviously brings costs down with it. So let's take a couple of, with that background, let's take a scenario here, a few scenarios, and show you how the data moves between HardDollar and Primavera. What are those touch points? So just to set the stage a little bit, we did talk about, Primavera does a great job at applying the timing of a project. HardDollar does a great job at modeling the cost of a project, and they really affect each other. So we wanted to, the one thing that we wanted to do when we built this integration was we wanted to eliminate any kind of import-export. We didn't want to have to go through some sort of merge, purge kind of process. We wanted to make it very iterative. So, you can imagine as you do maybe that first estimate and your first schedule, and you sort of get things the way you like it, well then, invariably something changes. The scope of the project changes, the timing changes. So we have to be able to go sort of around that circle multiple times. We need to be able to add scope into the estimate. Well, that scope drives new activities into the schedule. If we change maybe we try to accelerate the project, so we need to be able to see how that affects the estimate. So we want to be able to easily do what-if scenarios and go through those multiple iterations as the project changes. Okay, so let's take a view into that. I'm going to just jump over into HardDollar. I wish in this sort of a format we could show you two screens, because really HardDollar and Primavera are working in the background. They're sort of talking and working at the same time, but I can only show you one screen at a time, so I'll just flip back and forth. But what you're looking at here is I've gone into the HardDollar tool. I've opened up a project, this process job. And you can see over on the left the cost breakdown structure, or CBS, for this project. You can see it's kind of a tree or a hierarchy starting at the top. And there's some of those things, like I mentioned, that you may or may, you don't often see in a schedule, but they are part of the budget. Things like escalation or job management, overhead type costs, contingencies. Right? So those are in our cost breakdown structure. And then you really get into the work scope. In this case, we've organized it by discipline. There's some civil work, steel work. And if I open those up, I can see underneath the civil work we've got some various subsections, and we can just keep drilling down. There's our foundations under that concrete section. Okay, so very much like Primavera in terms of, it's a hierarchical structure. You can break the work down into as much detail as you like. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the estimating side itself, but suffice it to say that there's a lot of different methods to arriving at what you're seeing on this screen. So if we look at, say, that machine excavation task, you can see we have a budget in here of $214,000. Our current estimate, or CE, is $214,000 for that. And that's based on about 1,800 man-hours, 75 days of work. If I open that up, we're going to be able to see, what is driving that cost. In this case, it's some operated equipment. There's equipment with an operator, and there's some dump trucks, etc., each working for different hours. That's one way out of probably a dozen or more methods of driving the cost of something. Everything from a simple plug number to a bottoms-up estimate using resources and production rates and factors and all sorts of things can be applied. Okay, but what we're going to see is how this ties into Primavera. That duration of 75 days could have been driven from the estimate based on a productivity rate, or and passed to Primavera, or it could have come back to Primavera that, hey, we've got 75 days to do this, what sort of how big does the crew need to be? What sort of production rate do we need to achieve to get it done? So this you'll see the integration is going to go both ways. Okay, so if we take a couple more glances at a few things here before we jump into Primavera, back on the HardDollar side, you see up at the top here that escalation item. If I drill into that, obviously the cost of escalation on a project is going to be a function of the schedule. So here you can see kind of a standard template that we've set up in this job for escalation. So we've got, you can see those escalation tables can be based on a time frame, which might be a whole year. It might be just a seasonal thing. You can see here right now, HardDollar, by looking at the Primavera schedule, it knows that all of the work is going on in 2013, so that as we get into 2014 and 15, there's no escalation being applied. Okay, but it's set up to handle that. So if we look at 2014, what we're saying here is any costs that end up in 2014, we're going to escalate those by 15%. Okay, and I've done a nice 15% across the board, but if we could escalate our labor costs differently than our materials and any other cost types that you like. Okay, and then as we get into, if any of the work ends up in 2015, we're going to apply a 20% escalation. Okay, with that simple setup, now I can feel free to move the schedule around. If the owner directs me to move the schedule, we're going to, and some of the costs ends up in 2014 or 15, then that escalation is going to apply automatically. Okay, let's go take a look now at the corresponding Primavera schedule, and then, like I said, I'm just going to kind of flip back and forth. Here's our Primavera schedule. Okay, there's that machine excavation item that we were looking at for 75 days. Okay, so this schedule could have been developed originally and then fed into HardDollar, or with the touch of a button, HardDollar could, which is what I did here, HardDollar created this schedule for me from the activities that I choose in the HardDollar estimate. So all of these items came into the schedule automatically. Their durations came in automatically. Their resources came in automatically. Okay, so if we look down below, we can see there's that dump truck and those operators and those various pieces of equipment. So we resource loaded this Primavera schedule automatically. Okay, what's left to do is really the things that Primavera is great at, which is figuring out the relationships between the items. What are constraints that we're going to have? Things can't start until a certain date, etc. Okay, so now we've got a model both in the schedule and in the cost estimate that's tied together. So as we start doing some changes, we can see how those affect each other. Okay, so this project right now is, you can see it's going into 2013. Let's make some changes that are going to extend the project. So maybe let's take some of these earthwork items that looks like we assumed a start-to-start connection on those. Maybe we're going to do some simultaneous work with a little bit of lag there. Let's make those finish starts, or excuse me, start to start. I'm sorry, finish to start. Let's do that. So we'll assume maybe due to the complexity of the work, we're going to have to finish each one of those tasks before we can start the next one. So let's take that fine grade. We'll go to its relationship, and as I said, it's currently a start to start with the previous one. Let's do it as a finish to start. And then we'll do the same thing on this next one. So, just by doing those two changes, and I'm going to go ahead and update my schedule, now we're going to see the schedule push a little bit. Right, so now those things are happening with finish to start connections. Okay, and now we're into 2014 as our finish date for this project. Let's take this first task that was going to happen here. So maybe originally we were going to start the project at the beginning of 2012. Obviously, we're past that now, so now maybe the project is not going to start until, maybe let's say the end of 2012. So I'm going to drag that item over, put a constraint on it, update my schedule, and now everything's moving forward. Okay, and then in fact, let's move it a little bit more so we get some costs going into 2015. Okay, so now we can answer the question, well, if we move the project start date to where we just moved it, and we do the work sequentially rather than with start to starts on those earthwork items, well, now Now we're finishing into April 2015. Okay, the beauty is now I don't have to remember to go back to my estimate and reflect those changes. If I tab back over to HardDollar now and we say, all I've got to do is come up here and say, let's update HardDollar from Primavera. Okay, so you'll see as that happens, and I'm going to say, let's go ahead and update the estimate to stay in sync. Again, I don't have to worry about what items have changed. I don't have to worry about coming back and dealing with that escalation. So as you can see here, as it's updating, you see those numbers changing in my escalation. So it goes through and it analyzes the Primavera schedule, and now you can see we got a whole different picture now for escalation. We have higher costs because those costs are more in 2014 and a little bit in 2015. So we've accounted for those costs now in our budget without having to worry about going in line by line and remembering to do that. Okay. One of the things that we do on the HardDollar side, we bring back all of the start and finish dates for the items in the project. Okay, so if I go back to that cost breakdown structure, and I'm going to go to a little bit different view now. So this view, much like in Primavera, we can have different columns turned on in our views. I'm going to go to more of a scheduling-oriented view, and we'll come down here. You can see a bunch of different views that I've created. You can create your own views. Let's go to a schedule setup view. And this is where you can control really what happens between HardDollar and Primavera. Which items do we want to synchronize with the schedule? Do we want to roll up items? We may have more detail in the budget than we want in the schedule, so we can roll items together. And then if we move over to the right, you're going to see there's the start and finish dates for those items that came back in from Primavera. Okay, you see that structural steel item down there? We did roll that one up, and it's actually summing up the children. Okay, so the children are contributing to the schedule, but the start and finish dates are at the parent level. So we have one bar on the schedule for all the structural steel. Okay, but those dates come back. Well, what do we do with those dates? One of the things HardDollar does with those dates, in addition to, like you saw on calculating escalation, is we can give you a cash flow graph. Okay, so based on our payment schedule from the owner, if we're playing the contractor role here, okay, we can see, it looks like we're getting an upfront payment of a certain amount, and then we're not getting another, other payments are driven by work completed, payment milestones. So based on this extended schedule now, you can see, obviously, with that upfront payment, we're starting out cash flow positive. The green line is above the red line. The red line is our cost. Okay, but there is a point here where it's getting pretty close to being underwater there, where our cost is potentially getting right up to our revenue. So this is the kind of visibility that you've got by bringing the cost and the schedule models together. If we were to change anything in the schedule, or if we were to change anything in the project, and on the HardDollar side, we'll see that scheduled cash flow graph change. So, for example, one of the things HardDollar does is as you see here, we model the revenue, not just the cost. If we go back to, if this item, this project, let's say, is there's payment milestones associated with this project, with that civil work, which you saw on the schedule, we go in here and define the earnings rules. Right now we're saying, we get 50% of that item's revenue at the start of the excavation. And then as we scroll down, you can see we got a lot of zeros here. We don't get paid anything for fine grading and form work and rebar. In fact, we don't get the rest of it until we're finished doing the embankment. Okay, if we change that, and maybe we negotiate with the owner, hey, we want, maybe we come down here and we say, let's do 25% when we're done with embankment, and maybe, let's move some of that up. We get 25% maybe when we're done with the form work, or maybe when we start the form work. Those things are any of those things are going to have an impact on our cash flow. So if we come back here and look at our cash flow, now we have a much better picture. Our cost is still the same, right? But now with that, if we've renegotiated the payment milestones, now we can see what does that do to our cash flow, and it's looking a lot better. Okay, now obviously sometimes your payment milestones are fixed. and you don't have control over them like I just did, but at least you have visibility to, what does our cost look like in relation to the revenue. Now let's go the other way. Let's take some. So we saw how a change in Primavera can drive costs on the hard dollar side and drive cash flow. Let's go the other direction now. Let's go back into our estimate here. I'm going to go back to that previous view. And actually, let's go to a view that's got a little more detail in it. Let's go to this one here. What I'm going to do now is let's focus in on those earthwork items that we moved around on the schedule a little bit. Let's, after further evaluation, maybe we realize those items are going to be more challenging than we thought. So this is what I'm going to do is apply a factor to a couple of those earthwork items, and that will extend the duration. So you can see right now those durations are, 75 days, 104 days, and 250 days. Let's take the first two items there. I'm just going to highlight them, open that up, and I'm going to apply a factor. So if we go to this factors window here, you can have up to 10 different factors on every item. You can see I'm using the first of those factors for a geographic influence. The second one is a difficulty factor. So without, spending a lot of time redoing the crew and production rate and things like that, maybe we just want to put a factor of, we'll make it an obvious example here, we'll put a factor of 2 on it for difficulty. So this is going to be twice as difficult as our original assumption. And by doing that, now you're going to see those durations are double what they were before. Okay, so HardDollar has already accounted for that in the cost model, in the estimate. So that change right there has increased our cost that you see out to the right. By the way, you see all of these things are in US dollars, and that one item there we're actually measuring in another currency, in pulas actually in this case. That's really there just to show that we do support multiple currencies. You can mix and match currencies in the same project. It all adds up and gets converted to US dollars in this case at the bottom. Okay, but back to the scenario, we've doubled the durations for those. Again, now I need to get those durations into the Primavera schedule. I don't have to remember to go do those one by one back in Primavera. All I've got to do now is say, let's update Primavera from HardDollar. Based on my configuration settings, it's saying, hey, what do you want to update? Do you want to? It's always going to update the WBS and the activities, but do you also want to update the resource loading? Do we want to update any actuals, which we're not going to do because we're not into the execution stage yet. We could update other things if we wanted to turn those on in the settings. So I'm just going to update the resource loading and the WBS, which always happens. And so you're going to see it's basically going to go through and look at what's changed in the estimate, what's different in the estimate that hasn't been pushed over into the schedule. And all I've got to do is sit and watch as it does its thing. It's going to go through and do that analysis and update those durations in the Primavera schedule accordingly. I can keep working while this is going on. You can see it didn't take too long, but if I wanted to, I could have minimized that window and continued working. But now I'm just going to go back to Primavera, hit my refresh button, and now you can see those durations, machine excavation and fine grade, are updated in the Primavera schedule. One click on the Primavera side to update that schedule using the CPM logic, and now all our schedule bars fall into place, and we've got a new finish date of December 2015. Okay, so that gives us, the ability to do those full circle evaluations, dealing with changes, looking at, how does changes to the scope affect the cost and the schedule, and then completing that circle back the other direction. How do those schedule durations affect the cost back in the estimate? This new finish date obviously is going to drive higher escalation costs back in the HardDollar estimate. Okay, if I wanted to, that was a little bit more detailed example in terms of changing some durations. Maybe there's a, we just want to add a new item. So there's a new scope of work. When I come into the HardDollar side, we'll just call it new scope. Right? So I can go in and figure out how I want to estimate that item using all those different approaches we talked about. But again, maybe I've added items all over the place, 10, 20, 100 different items into the scope. I've got them into my cost model. In order to get them into that Primavera schedule, I don't have to start over. All I've got to do is hit that update button, and it's going to push those new scope items into the Primavera schedule automatically for me. Okay, so you can see again it's doing that analysis, looking at what's changed. In this case, what's changed is we've added some new scope, and it's figuring out based on our rules, where does that go in the Primavera schedule, what coding needs to be applied, are there any resources or costs that need to be pushed over. And then as soon as we come back into Primavera, there's that new scope. Okay, and you can see what happens here when that new item goes into the Primavera schedule. Primavera doesn't quite know what to do with it other than where to put it in the structure. It's assuming that it's going to start on the project's defined start date. But now at this point we could tie it in. Maybe that item needs to happen. Maybe it's going to happen after let's say the machine excavation. So I'll go ahead and choose that. Update the schedule. And now you see that fall into place. Machine excavation is done. It leads to that new scope. So, as we continue to estimate out that scope item, build its duration, you're going to see that bar get wider. Its cost will show up on the HardDollar side and on the Primavera side based on the resource loading and the cost loading. Okay, last thing we'll take a look at, and then we'll open it up for questions. We've kind of started down this path and looking at that cash flow. One of the other things that we do with those durations and those dates that we bring back from Primavera is we can look at resource utilization. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the display settings on the HardDollar side. Right now, you can see there's a lot of options on here. Right now, we're only looking at a tiny bit of those things turned on. Right now, we're looking at just cost and revenue. Okay, there's lots of other things we can look at in terms of once the project gets underway, let's graph our as-built costs as well. Let's graph our earned value. We can even calculate finance costs for you based on surplus and shortages of cost versus revenue. We can graph each cost category. And most importantly, we can graph resource utilization. So if we look over here and say, yeah, we want to look at our resource utilization on this graph, how do we want to look at those resources? We'll look at them by description. We could also look at them by type or by code. We'll just do it by description. So I've got a list of all the resources that are both in Primavera and in HardDollar being shared. So if we say, let's see, if we don't have anything turned on right now, let's turn on our, let's say our carpenters. We'll graph those in gray. Let's go down and find maybe some other types of, let's turn on maybe a, let's see what else we got here, maybe like a general labor. Maybe we'll graph that in blue. Okay. And we'll graph those, let's do those as bar charts is how we'll do those. Okay, so now when we look at that graph, not only do we see our cost and revenue on there, now we can also see, when do those resources start to come into play. So when do we need those carpenters? We can see how they're kind of up and down. We can see those general laborers that are kicking in 2014. Okay, so obviously at this point, the beauty of this is we've got visibility to all this information, and as we can do what-if scenarios looking across both the HardDollar estimate and the schedule. If we go back into those settings, one of the other options that we can apply here is let's look at not only when those, so for example, the revenue that you saw as a green line on there, let's not only look at when we earn the revenue, but let's look at when we actually collect the cash. So again, playing the contractor role, and you can play it both ways as the owner or the contractor. Okay, but as the contractor, let's say we submit our payment request to the owner every 30 days, and let's say it takes 30 days to get paid. 10% is held for retainage, and we get that retainage at the end of the job. Okay, well, now when I come back to cash flow, if I turn on my revenue cash line, now we're going to see the difference between when we earn the revenue and when we actually collect it. Okay, so you see that green bar right there, solid green bar, is reflecting the timing difference between when we earn the revenue and when we collect it. So if we zoom into that area right there, we start earning revenue after that initial payment. We're earning it right here, but we're not collecting it until way over here. And we can do the same thing from a cost perspective to look at, hey, when do we pay our subs, when do we pay our vendors, or again, if we're the owner, we can apply it in that direction in terms of, when do we pay the contractor, to look at, what do we expect our actual cash outlay to be, and ensuring that we don't, go over our allocated budget. Okay, so the last thing that I'll show you is just a glimpse of some of the other forms inside the HardDollar menu. We've really been focusing just on the cost breakdown structure and the cash flow. We do have, as I mentioned, quite a bit of options in here in terms of managing the whole project cycle. Everything from dealing with pay items and proposals in terms of generating tenders and bids, soliciting quotes from subs, vendors, choosing the appropriate quotes, and then into job tracking, tracking variances against actuals, tracking forecasts, tracking estimates to complete. And then you can see it's grayed out right here because we haven't started this project, but then we also have a formal process for dealing with budget and contract changes as the project progresses and goes through its life cycle. Okay, so a lot of value that we add around Primavera, again, sort of kind of before it and after it, in terms of the estimate. Then Primavera handles the schedule in the middle, and then on the other side we handle project management, scope management, change management, forecasting, and variances versus actual. So with that, let me go ahead and we'll turn it back over to Brett. I think our plan right now is we'll open up the mics and take any questions.
Yeah, well, I got a couple questions that were typed in, so if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in. The first question is, how would you track progress on each activity, actual work completed?
All right, great question. So there's a number of ways to do that. Let me point you to where you would do it. If we came in here and said, let's go ahead and go into job tracking for this project, you can see right now, in this case now we've got a different set of columns, and there's hundreds of columns here to choose from as well. We've got a few of them turned on. So for example, % complete. So in terms of adding progress or tracking progress, I can do that through a data source. Okay, so I can pull in that progress if you've got an Excel spreadsheet that you're using out in the field to track quantities. If you've got it in a timesheet system, we can point to those data sources and bring them in that way. Or it could be as simple as, you can do it right in HardDollar. If I go into that machine excavation item, I can simply come down here and say, okay, let's say we started the work today, and I want to put in a % complete for that day's work or a quantity completed. Okay, you can see this project, the quantity was 52,083 cubic yards. So I can turn in a quantity. If we did 5,000 cubic yards today, that backs into the % complete. Okay, or I can put in the % complete. Maybe I'm using my best judgment. I feel like we're 10% complete. That backs into the quantity. Well, you must have done 5,200 units. And then we could proceed to, if there was a cost associated with that, if we wanted to record resource hours, or again, import that actual cost from our financial system. Okay, we could also turn in man hours here, and we can see on this status view, we've got 3,600 man hours in the budget. Okay, and this plan to date value here shows us, if we're 10% complete, then we should have expended 360 man hours to date. Right, so if we put in, maybe we've spent 400 man hours, the system's going to keep track of, there's our as-built man hours, 400. Here's what we should have incurred, 360. Right, so we've spent 40 more man hours, or 11% more than we should have at this point. Okay, just for that item, and that's going to roll back into this this main register here, where we can look at that same kind of information across all the items, whether we're looking at earned value, and we of course could turn on columns to show, actual man hours versus expended man hours, forecast, and other information. So hopefully that answered the question around progress.
I think it sounds like it went pretty thorough with that. The next question is, how do you use the software to determine out-of-sequence activities, which I think would probably happen on the P6 side?
Yeah, and Brett, I don't know if you want to touch that one from the P6 perspective. I know from HardDollar's perspective, we certainly bring back the start and finish dates, into HardDollar. So, back on the CBS or on the job tracking register, if we go to that view that has the dates on it, we could certainly sort by start and finish date. So we could sort on those fields and then start to look at, or maybe let's sort on the start date, and then you can kind of work your way down the list and see, is this a logical progression? But I think the majority of that sort of analysis, is going to be done on the Primavera side.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. That will be done on the Primavera side. The next question is, are there any preloaded cost databases available?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, let me go back to maybe a picture's worth 1,000 words here. That view here kind of shows some of the databases that we support. So we do have RS Means available. We do have Richardson's available. And then we also, if you're into the mining sector, we have a database from CostMine that any of those can be used. And then we do have, there's a number of other data sources that we've sort of helped customers hook in. We have a pretty flexible API where you can point to other data sources that may be proprietary to you, or maybe not as widespread as some of these others. But we have a very open platform that allows us to, reference or bring in price information from third-party sources.
Okay, so here the next question's kind of a detailed question on how do you compare yourself to a full-blown cost system like an EcoSys. I don't know if you're familiar with EcoSys or a Cobra.
Yeah, actually I'm familiar with both of those. Yep.
Or Cobra. Okay. Seems like HardDollar can do a lot of these features. Looks like it may be simpler. Do you see these tools as competitors or just some overlap in functionality?
That's a great question. They are competitors, but the overlap is fairly small. So they're almost more like Primavera in terms of, they're in the same space, but there's not a whole lot of overlap. So for example, something like an EcoSys or a Cobra from Deltek are really focused on sort of, the cost management side, earned value. They both do a strong job at calculating earned value. But what they're missing, the main difference between HardDollar and those two systems in particular, is they're missing the detailed cost model. Those two systems don't get into estimating. They don't get into doing bottoms-up, resource-driven cost models. Right? So they approach it more from a financial standpoint. We've got a budget already, let's say, now let's manage the budget. Where HardDollar really shines is leveraging all of those variables that went into the budget. Right? So we know that the budget for something is $1 million, but we also know why it's $1 million. What crews, what production rates, what factors, what geographic influences, so that you can change those things and see the impact on the budget. And then secondly, those details really come in handy when you're doing forecasts. So financial systems typically are going to approach forecasting from a purely arithmetic standpoint, which is frustrating often. You get into scenarios where, well, we've lost, we're 50% done with a scope item, and we've lost $100,000 compared to budget. So, well, we're going to lose $200,000 by the time we're totally done with it. So the systems will sort of interpolate where you're going to end up. What HardDollar does, we can do it that way. That's an option. But then we also have the ability to really apply your own judgment and those, leverage those details. It may be that, that's the way the budget was originally set up is we were going to have, worse productivity in the first half of that item and better productivity in the second half, which could be seasonal. It could be learning curves. Those things can influence the forecast, so you don't end up with these, forecasts that are just based on math, right? You can apply some human judgment to that. So I would say, as a short summary, the biggest difference between HardDollar and those two systems, EcoSys and Cobra, is that we do have all the variables that go into the cost model, not just the budget itself, to apply to forecasting and change management and variance analysis. And then I would also say that our integration with Primavera, I think generally Primavera will, backs this up in terms of our integration is much more dynamic with Primavera in terms of there's a lot of configuration options and a lot of ways to control that interface. But at the end of the day, you see things going back and forth in a very seamless way, and we've really set the stage and sort of raised the bar on that back in 2006, and we've continued to expand on that integration. We feel that's one of our core competencies.
Great, Brad. Thank you for that. That was a great answer, and I also agree with you on your point about the integration between HardDollar and Primavera. I think it's a really nice integration. It's very thorough, and it's of the integrations I've seen, it's probably one of the best out there that I've ever seen. So it's a really good integration. The last question we have here is, does it take that information and turn it into productivity in terms of quantities, completed resources, expended, or are you limited to tracking it by earned value? The quantity resources, then can it be tracked by discrete time periods?
Great question. Let's take that item where we've made an initial entry where after the first day we completed 10%. Let's make another entry, and then we'll see how the system does turn that into productivity. Let's say maybe it actually started on Monday the 13th. So we'll go back in time here a little bit. Oops, 8/13. So maybe we'll do, let's say on that day we did, let's say 5,000 units. And maybe we spent, maybe we actually spent more man hours to achieve that smaller quantity. Maybe we spent 440 man hours, let's say. Based on those entries of quantities and or percent complete along with the man hours, now we can calculate, in fact, let's do a duration here. These were 8-hour days. Now we can look at productivity in a number of different ways. In fact, we'll graph it for you. If I go into this productivity view here, you can see this graph. These lines ended up very close together. Let's make them more disparate. Maybe we spent 600 man hours on this one, and we'll update that graph. Now I made it too dramatic. Let's go. And 8 hours. Bear with me here. Okay, so what you're seeing in this graph, and right here is where we can look at productivity. So our planned production was, 43 cubic yards per hour, okay, based on durations. Let's look at this in terms of cubic yards per man hour, or man hours per cubic yard. Okay, now we've got a better view, probably a more realistic view. It depends on how you want to look at productivity. You want to look at man-hour productivity or duration productivity in terms of days, hours, etc. But here's how many man-hours per cubic yard are we expending. There's the plan, the blue line, 0.07. Now we see, as the work is progressing, it's calculating an average production for us. So far, we're spending 0.1 man-hours per cubic yard. So we're 40% below where we wanted to be. And then we also show the green line there, the most recent day that we did work, we were at 0.08 man-hours per cubic yard. So one of the things we try to do throughout the system is not only show you where you are, but also show you which direction are you trending. Are we getting better or are we getting worse? In this case, we're getting better. Right? We're spending fewer and fewer man-hours per cubic yard as we go along here. We're getting back to that plan. And this is the kind of detail I was talking about when we're trying to do a forecast. If we just came over here and looked at the status and see that, so far on our the man hours, we're 41% over on our man hours so far. We might be tempted to just assume that same level of overage is going to continue for the rest of the way, right? But if we can see a view that looks like this, now that tells us something. We might assume now we're going to be maybe back to plan, or maybe even better than plan. And when you get into forecasting in HardDollar, you've got a lot of choices. You can use, what do we want to use to drive the forecast? Do we want to use that average so far, which is kind of the accounting or financial system approach? Or do we want to, for the rest of the way, let's assume we're going to be back to the budget or the plan or what was in the current estimate? Or let's use that most recent value. Maybe the crew is trained up, the learning curve is done, and so the performance we achieved yesterday is what we want to use going forward to do that forecast. So hopefully that answers the question on productivity. I mean, HardDollar's mission is all about cost and productivity. So we love getting questions about productivity. That is, one of the things that we can show you because we do have all those details, not just the budget.
Great. Well, we have one more question. It is, does HardDollar keep a log of all inputs or changes made to the project?
Another great question. Absolutely. I don't know whether I turned that log on for this project, but let's find out. There's a little icon right here that allows us to look at changes, and actually it does. So I'm sure everybody remembers perfectly all the changes we've made today in this project. So here's a little test for you. As we look back at that changes log, you can see it's been tracking for me who made the change, what was the date and time the change was made, what is it that changed. You can see, remember we applied those difficulty factors for those 2 earthwork items. So, you can see here we changed, from a 1 factor to a 2 factor. And what did that do if we shorten this column up here? You can see our difference column over to the far right. Right? So applying that difficulty factor there, increased our budget by $461,000. And you can look back through there, even changes that came back in from Primavera that affected our finish dates and our start dates, those are tracked in the log. Okay, so we can see, that change of when that item, that job management and equipment item, which is an overhead item, because the finish date for the project when it moved from 2013 to 2015, right, that increased our, overhead costs for that, project managers and so forth by about, $33,000. As we scroll over there, you see that $33,000 difference. So all of the changes that you make, whether you make them directly in HardDollar or whether they're coming in from Primavera, do get tracked in this log. You can also make notes. If we go to a simple view here on our changes log, you're going to see the ability to make notes. You can go back and make notes on each one of those changes just to, sort of flesh out that audit trail to help you remember, why did we make those changes.
We got one more question. Do you build your production and crew tables before you start a model, or do you pull those in from an external source?
So the production and crew models you can actually go either way. I would say most of our customers are going to build those in advance and keep them in our library. So our library, in fact, I've done some examples here to show our security. You can see some of these menu choices are turned off. That's because I don't have security to go in and change those master rates. Okay, and that can be different. Well, you might have what we call assemblies, which are crews, and that's where you can kind of set up those models, those crew models. So you can have standard ones, store them in the library, and then bring the relevant ones into each project, into the forms of each project. So you can see I have security to get into those in this project, but I can't go in and mess with them in the library. If I go into this project, let's look at the crews in here. And let's say, here's for example, a concrete crew, a small concrete crew. We can see that it's a 4-person crew. It costs $108 an hour. If I open that up, it's going to show me, well, what's in that crew. We got 2 skilled carpenters, 2 laborers. You can also have equipment in here, and then basically look at, what's the relationship. How many of these things do we need for this entire crew? And then the production rate can be a factor of a lot of different things. What's the geography? What's the difficulty level? Where's the work being done? Those sort of things can impact the production rate, which, as we saw back on our cost breakdown structure, if we go back into that machine excavation item, you're going to see where all of that comes together if we go into our production section. So right now, we dictated the crew productivity from the schedule. You can see that red arrow is pointing to the hours. So that's telling us that that duration came in from Primavera, or we directly typed it in. Okay, but in other words, we're working from the top down. We got the duration in place, that backed into the productivity. We've got to do 694 yards a day if we're going to get it done in 75 days. Okay. The other way to go is from the bottom up. If we know that this crew can only do 400 yards a day, right, or we can achieve 400 yards a day, now that gives us a duration. It calculates a new duration of 130 days, 1,041 hours based on how many hours per day we're working. And then that duration could be passed over to Primavera. So that can go both directions. The resources themselves, as you saw, do go back and forth between HardDollar and Primavera. So we can resource load this task with the HardDollar resources, so you don't have to type them in twice. Okay, and I guess the last thing, based on looking at the question again, those crew productivity rates, like the 50 yards per hour or 400 yards per day, these things can all be imported from an outside data source as well. So if you have some tables, maybe some production rates, maybe from equipment manufacturers, you can import those in, to drive those productivity rates. You can bring them in from RS means, and then you might want to apply some factors to them like we did earlier. So a lot of flexibility there.
And we have one more question. Is there a report that can be used that represents a typical payment application?
Yeah, so I would say that I've not seen necessarily a typical one. Everybody kind of uses different formats, in terms of how much detail do you want, how much backup do you want, is it T&M work, is it unit price work? So a lot of different flavors of that. But know that we do calculate what we call pay requests. So as the work progresses, in fact, now that we put in some percent complete on this job as a unit price job, we will probably see some earnings in here. So if we look at that civil item, and in terms of a pay request, if we scroll over to the right now, we should see here's some earned value starting to come in, and now, we should start to see some earned revenue being calculated as well. So, earned revenue on that item, $1,400,000 so far, and then we can go in and put in an accepted value if if we and the owner perhaps come up with a different number that we can bill. Then we can go in and record what is that earned value that we've accepted, and then any remainder will show up in pending, and we'll track what sort of unbilled so far. So and we can do that by date. So we can look at, here's the first day that we calculated a payment request for this civil work. It was back in July, and at the time we'd only done a little bit of work. Right. So if we were to do a new pay request, that's you'd see as I open that up, we'd see a new one on. Typically you're going to do it once a month, every 2 weeks. You'd see a new row for each one of those. So we do track those earned revenue amounts that drive a payment request in terms of the report format. We have a number of different formats that you can use. We find a lot of customers kind of have their own templates for those, and they're going to take our data that we've calculated and just drop it into those templates in Microsoft Word or something along those lines. So hopefully that answered that question.
Great, thanks, Brad. That was the last question. So it doesn't look like there are any more. I just want to say, number one, thank you very much, Brad. That was an excellent overview of the integration. It's very exciting. It's a very, it's as I mentioned before, I think it's one of the best integrations I've seen, and we're very excited about it. Also, as far as this webinar went, we had really a great number of very great questions. I thought the questions were excellent. I appreciate the questions from everybody that attended. And if you do have any more questions, please feel free to give us a call. Also, we'll probably be following up with you at some point within the next week just to see if there's any questions that you might have or any more information we can provide you. If you look on the screen, you'll see that's actually my contact information, my phone number, direct number, as well as my email address. Feel free to contact me, and I appreciate you taking your time and spending it with us this afternoon. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Brad.